At 1:19 am, a Boeing 777 flying across Southeast Asia transmitted 4 simple words. Good night, Malaysian 370. No distress call. No urgency. No warning. Just a routine radio handoff between air traffic control sectors. And then, silence. For most people, those words sound like nothing unusual. But in aviation, even the most ordinary transmissions are part of a highly structured system designed for one purpose: keeping aircraft continuously visible, continuously tracked, and continuously in communication. And what makes MH370 one of the most studied aviation cases in modern history is not just what was said, but what stopped being said immediately after. Before we go further, it's important to understand what MH370 actually was as a flight. On March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 departed Kuala Lumpur International Airport shortly after midnight. The aircraft was a Boeing 777-200ER. At the time, the Boeing 777 had one of the strongest safety records in commercial aviation. It was widely considered a long-range, highly reliable aircraft used by airlines around the world for intercontinental travel. On board were 239 passengers and crew members. The destination was Beijing Capital International Airport, a standard international route, flown daily, familiar to pilots, familiar to air traffic controllers. Nothing about this flight suggested anything out of the ordinary. Weather conditions along the route were stable. No severe storms were reported. No unusual atmospheric disturbances were detected. No public technical warnings were issued before departure. From an operational perspective, MH370 began like thousands of other commercial flights operating every day across the world. But aviation safety is not built on how normal a flight appears at departure. It is built on continuous confirmation that the flight remains within expected communication and tracking systems. And that brings us back to the timeline. Shortly after takeoff, MH370 climbed into cruising altitude and entered its planned flight corridor toward Beijing. Air traffic control communications followed standard procedures. Pilots communicated using established aviation phraseology, designed to ensure clarity and reduce misunderstanding across international airspace. And everything continued normally. Until 1:19 am. At that moment, MH370 was instructed to contact the next air traffic control sector as it transitioned between regions. This handoff is a routine part of international aviation. Aircraft regularly move from one control region to another as they cross national airspace boundaries. And at 1:19 am, the expected response came back. Good night, Malaysian 370. On the surface, nothing about this message suggests anything unusual. It is calm, professional, standard. Exactly what aviation communication is designed to be. But here is where aviation analysis becomes important. In modern flight operations, communication is only one layer of a much larger system. Aircraft are tracked through multiple overlapping technologies: primary radar, secondary radar, transponder systems, and satellite-based communication networks. Each system serves a specific function. And together, they create redundancy to ensure continuous tracking of aircraft anywhere in the world. This redundancy is one of the key reasons why commercial aviation is considered extremely safe. But redundancy also depends on continuity. If communication stops at a specific point, other systems must continue providing visibility. And that is where MH370 becomes historically significant. Because after this final transmission, something changed. Not immediately obvious, not dramatic, but operationally critical. The aircraft did not make its expected check-in with the next air traffic control sector. At first, this was not classified as an emergency. In aviation operations, missed check-ins can occur for several reasons: frequency changes, timing delays, procedural overlaps between control regions, or temporary communication issues. However, as time passed and no contact was re-established, controllers began to escalate their concern. At this stage, MH370 was still expected to be within radar coverage. Civilian radar systems track aircraft using ground-based stations. These systems depend on transponders onboard aircraft to identify position and altitude. And when communication is lost, controllers rely on radar data to maintain situational awareness. But MH370 did not continue behaving as expected within that system. It did not provide consistent tracking updates. And soon, it began to disappear from civilian radar coverage. Now, this does not mean the aircraft vanished physically. It means it was no longer being continuously tracked within the civilian air traffic control network. And that distinction is critical in aviation analysis. Because loss of radar tracking does not immediately indicate catastrophe. Aircraft can transition between radar coverage zones. They can move beyond range limitations, or temporarily lose transponder visibility under certain conditions. This is why investigators do not rely on a single system. They analyze multiple data sources before drawing conclusions. But in the case of MH370, what made the situation unusual was not just the loss of radar contact. It was the absence of any accompanying emergency signal. No distress call. No emergency transponder code. No mechanical warning broadcast. From a system's perspective, this combination is extremely rare. And at this point in the timeline, investigators were left with a growing gap. They had a confirmed departure. They had a final transmission. But they no longer had continuous tracking data from primary systems. And in aviation investigation, gaps like this are not just missing information. They are active challenges that require reconstruction from secondary evidence. Because every missing minute becomes part of the investigation puzzle. And what investigators would later discover next would shift the entire understanding of how MH370 behaved after its final known communication. After the final transmission at 1:19 am, MH370 was expected to make contact with the next air traffic control sector. This was a routine handoff in international aviation. One control region transfers responsibility to another as the aircraft crosses into a new airspace boundary. But this time, the expected communication never arrived. At first, this was not immediately treated as a catastrophic event. In aviation operations, missed handoffs can occur due to timing mismatches, radio frequency issues, or procedural delays between control zones. Controllers attempted to re-establish contact using standard communication channels. No response was received. Then another attempt was made. Still no response. At this point, MH370 began to enter a phase that aviation investigators later described as a loss of continuous situational awareness. But it is important to understand what that actually means. In modern aviation, aircraft are not tracked by a single system. They are monitored through layered infrastructure. Radar networks, transponders, communication systems, and coordination between multiple air traffic control centers. Each layer is designed to reinforce the others. So when communication is lost, radar becomes the primary fallback system. Civilian radar systems use ground-based stations to detect aircraft positions through reflected signals and transponder responses. These systems are highly effective within their coverage zones. But they are not global. Coverage depends on geography, infrastructure, and distance limitations. As MH370 continued its flight path, controllers began to notice inconsistencies in its expected radar tracking position. It did not appear where it was supposed to be within the expected communication corridor. And then, civilian radar contact was lost. This does not mean the aircraft instantly disappeared from existence. It means it was no longer continuously tracked within the civilian air traffic control network. At this stage, aviation protocol shifts into coordination mode. Adjacent control centers are contacted. Military radar data is reviewed. Flight paths are reconstructed using available secondary information. And this is where a new layer of complexity enters the investigation. Military radar systems in the region later indicated that MH370 did not continue along its expected northbound route toward Beijing. Instead, radar data suggested a deviation in direction, a turn back across the Malay Peninsula. This information was not immediately available to civilian controllers in real time. It was reconstructed later through radar data analysis. And this distinction is extremely important in aviation investigation. Because real-time control systems and post-event reconstruction systems do not operate under the same conditions. Real-time systems prioritize immediate safety and traffic separation. Reconstruction systems prioritize pattern analysis and historical accuracy. At this point in the timeline, MH370 was no longer being actively tracked through civilian radar systems. But secondary radar evidence suggested that the aircraft was still airborne, still operational, and still moving through controlled airspace. This created a critical contradiction. An aircraft that was no longer visible in its expected tracking corridor, but had not yet triggered any emergency signals. No distress call. No emergency transponder code. No confirmation of mechanical failure. From a systems perspective, this represents one of the most challenging categories of aviation uncertainty. Because aviation safety systems are designed around the assumption that abnormal events will generate detectable signals. But MH370 did not immediately conform to those assumptions. As investigators later emphasized, this phase of the flight represents a transition from communication-based tracking to inference-based reconstruction, which means the aircraft's position was no longer being observed directly, but instead interpreted through fragments of radar data and secondary evidence. And at this point in the timeline, a new question began to emerge. If MH370 was no longer visible to civilian radar, but had not yet crashed or triggered emergency systems, then where exactly was it going? After MH370 disappeared from civilian radar, the investigation reached a critical limitation. There was no direct tracking data available from primary aviation systems, no continuous radar coverage, no real-time position reports. At this point, the aircraft had effectively moved beyond the reach of conventional air traffic control visibility. But the investigation did not stop. Because even when aircraft are no longer visible to radar systems, they may still interact with satellite networks. This is where a different type of data became essential. Not radar tracking, not voice communication, but automated satellite handshakes. MH370's aircraft communication system continued to exchange signals with an Inmarsat satellite network. These were not voice messages. They were not pilot communications. They were automatic technical signals between the aircraft's onboard system and a geostationary satellite. Each signal contained limited technical information. But when analyzed over time, these signals allowed investigators to estimate the aircraft's distance from the satellite at specific moments. This method does not provide an exact location. Instead, it produces a set of possible positions based on signal timing and geometry. When these points are connected together, they form curved pathways known as arcs. And these arcs became one of the most important breakthroughs in the investigation, because they suggested that MH370 continued flying for several hours after it disappeared from radar coverage. This was a critical shift in understanding. The aircraft was not simply lost at the point of radar disappearance. It had remained airborne far beyond that moment. However, the satellite data did not provide a direct flight path. It provided probabilities, multiple possible routes based on signal timing. And as investigators refined the models, one consistent pattern emerged: a southern trajectory extending into the remote southern Indian Ocean. This region is one of the most isolated areas of ocean on Earth, far from major flight corridors, far from routine shipping routes, and extremely difficult to monitor in real time. From an aviation systems perspective, this stage of the investigation represents a transition from direct observation to mathematical reconstruction. Instead of knowing exactly where the aircraft was, investigators had to infer its location using indirect signals. This is a fundamental concept in modern aerospace tracking. Not all systems are designed to provide precise positional data. Some systems are designed to confirm presence, timing, and connectivity. And when combined with physics-based modeling, they can still produce meaningful reconstruction of events. But they also introduce uncertainty, because inference is not the same as observation. And this distinction became central to the MH370 investigation. As satellite data analysis continued, the concept of a possible flight corridor began to take shape. A broad arc across the southern Indian Ocean, where the aircraft was most likely located based on signal behavior. However, within that corridor, no precise location could be determined. This meant that search efforts had to cover an extremely large and remote oceanic region. At this point, MH370 had effectively become what investigators sometimes refer to as a ghost flight path. Not because the aircraft was invisible in a literal sense, but because its movement could only be reconstructed through indirect data rather than continuous tracking. And this is where the investigation reached a new level of complexity. Because every additional model, every calculation, and every refinement still depended on limited data points. Each signal provided insight, but also introduced new uncertainty ranges. And as investigators worked through these models, one question became increasingly important. If MH370 continued flying along this inferred path, then where exactly did it end? As satellite data narrowed the possible flight corridor, the focus of the world shifted once again, this time from reconstruction to search and recovery. The search for MH370 became one of the largest and most complex international search operations in aviation history, coordinated across multiple countries. The operation involved naval forces, air assets, satellite analysts, and oceanographic experts working together across an immense and remote region of the southern Indian Ocean. Aircraft were deployed to scan vast stretches of open water. Ships conducted surface searches across unpredictable ocean conditions, and satellite imagery was continuously analyzed for any potential signs of debris. But the challenge facing search teams was unprecedented. The suspected area of the ocean was extremely remote, far from major shipping lanes, far from land-based observation points, and subject to some of the most difficult maritime conditions on Earth. Wave heights, weather variability, and deep ocean currents all contributed to making surface detection extremely unreliable. From an operational perspective, this was not a localized search. It was a large-scale probabilistic search across an environment where visibility was extremely limited. And as time passed, the search expanded further and further from initial expectations. Then months later, something changed the nature of the investigation. Debris began to appear. Small pieces of aircraft material were discovered along distant shorelines in the Indian Ocean region. Each piece was carefully analyzed and compared to MH370's aircraft specifications. Over time, several items were confirmed to be consistent with components from a Boeing 777. These findings provided the first physical evidence linked to the aircraft since its disappearance. However, the debris did not immediately reveal the full story. From a systems perspective, this is a critical distinction in aviation investigation. Debris confirms impact, but it does not define location, which means even with physical evidence, the exact crash site remained unknown. This is one of the most important challenges in oceanic aviation recovery. Unlike land-based accidents, where impact zones are often geographically contained, ocean environments introduce continuous movement through currents and drift patterns. This means debris can travel thousands of kilometers before reaching shore, and each piece must be carefully analyzed in both structural origin and drift modeling. As investigators worked through this data, the search area was refined further. But even with improved models and confirmed debris findings, the main wreckage of MH370 was never located within the primary search zones. This created a unique situation in aviation history. An aircraft confirmed missing, with partial physical evidence recovered, but without a fully identified crash location. At this stage of the investigation, global search operations gradually transitioned into long-term analysis mode. Active search efforts were reduced, and focus shifted toward refining models, analyzing drift patterns, and improving future tracking systems. From a human perspective, this phase of the MH370 investigation carried a different kind of weight. Not because of new discoveries, but because of what remained unresolved. Families of passengers were still seeking answers. Investigators were still analyzing data. And aviation experts were still refining models to better understand what could be learned from the case. As someone analyzing this from a systems and historical perspective, what stands out is not only the scale of the search, but the limitation of even the most advanced global coordination efforts when faced with extreme uncertainty. The search for MH370 demonstrated both the strength and the limits of modern aviation response systems. They are capable of mobilizing extraordinary global resources, but they still depend heavily on initial data accuracy. And when that data contains uncertainty, even the largest search effort in history can struggle to reach a definitive conclusion. And that reality leads directly into the final question that remains at the center of this case. What did MH370 ultimately teach us about aviation systems? And how they respond when information is incomplete? After years of investigation, analysis, and one of the largest search operations in aviation history, MH370 remains one of the most complex unresolved cases in modern aviation. We know certain facts with confidence. We know the aircraft departed Kuala Lumpur on March 8, 2014. We know it transmitted its final recorded message at 1:19 am. We know it disappeared from civilian radar shortly afterward. We know satellite data later suggested a long and remote flight path into the southern Indian Ocean. And we know that debris consistent with a Boeing 777 was recovered along distant shorelines. But despite all of this, the full sequence of events is still not completely understood. From an aviation systems perspective, MH370 is not studied as a single failure. It is studied as a convergence of multiple systems operating under incomplete conditions. Communication systems, radar systems, satellite tracking systems, search and rescue coordination. Each one performed within its designed capability. But none were originally intended to reconstruct a scenario with so many missing data points. And this is where the most important lesson emerges. Modern aviation safety is not built on eliminating uncertainty entirely. It is built on managing uncertainty through layers of redundancy, procedure, and continuous improvement. As investigators and aviation experts continue to study MH370, the focus has shifted from finding a single explanation to improving the systems that detect, track, and respond to rare anomalies in global flight operations. This includes advancements in real-time aircraft tracking, improvements in satellite communication reliability, and stronger coordination between international aviation authorities. But beyond the technical systems, there is also a human dimension that remains central to this story. Behind every data point, every radar track, there were 239 individuals, each with their own journey, their own destination, and people waiting for their arrival. In aviation history, MH370 stands as a reminder that even the most advanced systems in the world are ultimately designed to support human life, not replace human understanding. From a historical perspective, this case continues to influence how aviation professionals think about system design, data transparency, and global coordination. Not because it provides a simple answer, but because it demonstrates the importance of continuously improving the systems we rely on every day. And perhaps that is the most lasting lesson of MH370. Not what we fully know, but what it has forced us to keep asking. Because in aviation, every unanswered question becomes part of the foundation for safer skies in the future. And MH370 remains one of those questions. Still present, still studied, and still shaping the way we understand modern flight. And that is why this story continues to matter.